Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Brian Hansen, and I want to welcome you to tonight's program, United States Immigration and Border Policy in 2019. I am Vice President of Research here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and also host of the weekly podcast, Deep Dish on Global Affairs, that I encourage you to subscribe to. A quick reminder about tonight's program. It is on the record and we are live streaming. The Council is an independent and nonpartisan platform, and the views expressed here are those of the individuals we host and not the institutional positions of the Council. We also welcome social media engagement, but ask you to take a second to silence your phones. We're going to be taking questions from the audience here in the room as well as online. And if you want to submit a question online, you should open up your browser and type ccga.live, select today's program, and you'll be able to ask a question online. Little context for today's conversation. According to Pew Research, more than 1 million immigrants arrive in the United States each year, and the top sending countries are India, Mexico, China, and Cuba, as well as the U.S. Census reports that the foreign-born population in the United States today is at about the highest level it's been since 1910, with about 13.7% of the population. And in this context, of course, headlines are screaming about immigration all the time through social media, press articles, even presidential tweets. And the issue has become more and more divisive across the country. Indeed, the Chicago Council's annual survey, when we look at public opinion attitudes on foreign policy issues, this year we found the largest divide ever between Republicans and Democrats on whether or not immigration proposed or created a critical threat to U.S. security, where out of 13 options, Republican voters selected immigration as the most critical threat facing the United States, and Democrats rated it last. So tonight, we want to get beyond all of the fire of those headlines, and really we've got two experts to help us get beyond these headlines and understand what's really happening. What's going on with immigration? What is driving immigration to the United States? How is it being managed? What's taking place on the U.S.-Mexico border? And what happens when people actually arrive? It's my great pleasure to introduce our two panelists for tonight. Michelle Brané is the Senior Director of Migrant Rights and Justice Program at the Women's Refugee Commission, where she conducts research, develops policy recommendations, and advocates for critical protections for immigrant women, children, and other vulnerable immigrant populations in the United States. And joining us as well is Randy Capps, who is the Director of Research for U.S. Programs at the Migration Policy Institute. His areas of expertise include immigration trends, the authorized population, immigration in the U.S. labor force, and children of immigrants and their well-being. I'm going to moderate today's program, and I will start off with a panel discussion, and then we'll open it up for questions from you all as well. Please join me in welcoming our guests today. So, Randy, I want to start with you. You're a numbers guy. One of the things that you do is to have a deep sense of the data when it comes to immigration. And could you start off by painting a picture of who are the immigrants coming to the United States? Where are they coming from? I cited a little bit. How much of this is legal immigration? How much of it is illegal immigration? Help us understand what we're talking about.
Sure. So as of those recent numbers you mentioned, there are about 44 million immigrants in the U.S. officially. If they're undercounted in the Census Bureau products, maybe it's a couple million more than that. About half of them are from Latin America, almost a third now are from Asia, and Asia is the fastest growing population numerically. About a quarter from Mexico. You mentioned China and India, they're also in the top 10. Korea, Philippines, Vietnam, a number of other Asian countries as well. So right now there's maybe 10 to 12 million unauthorized immigrants. They're about a quarter of the total. Most accounts say that that number actually hasn't gone up in the last 10 years, maybe even has gone down a bit, despite what we've seen at the border recently. And a lot of the big trend that's driving the change right now, one of the big trends that's going unnoticed, is a decline actually in the number of immigrants from Mexico. So even though that's still the leading country, the number of Mexican immigrants may have gone down by as much as 1.5 to 2 million in the last 10 years. That has a lot to do with some changes in Mexico, but also has to do with stricter border enforcement over the last 10 years. And sort of where the border picture comes into play now is that one of the groups that's been growing most rapidly in the last 5 years or so has been migrants coming from Central America. And they, like the Mexicans before them, a fairly large share have, attempted to cross the U.S.-Mexico border illegally. And it's been dealing with that flow that's been the most controversial. I mean, at the same time, regardless of the change in administration and change in policies, we still continue to get about 1 million legal immigrants every year. And there haven't been major changes to U.S. immigrant admissions for some time.
So I think that's really helpful to put this in the bigger picture, because we talk about, or we hear about all the time, just what's going on at the border at any given moment. And Randy, you mentioned the fact that the composition of immigration coming over that border is changing. Right. Michelle, why has it changed, and what's driving people to come to the United States for the folks who are coming over the Mexican border?
Right. So in addition to the changes that Randy mentioned, what we've seen is a real demographic change. So not only are we seeing more people coming from Central America as opposed to, and less, fewer from Mexico, right? But we're also seeing more women and children in terms of the percentage of those people. So again, while the number has stayed fairly stable, it goes up and down, right? And we did see an increase recently, but it had also been going down for a number of years. The percentage of women and children and families in that population has now exceeded 50% in southern border crossers. And so that really is a very different demographic from adult men from Mexico coming and not seeking asylum. In most cases, those were men coming to work, and they would go back and forth across the border. Now we're seeing, again, families, that includes children, more women, who are coming and they're seeking asylum. And that is those populations have very different needs and very different processing needs in terms of how you deal with them when they approach the border. Why are they coming? I think there's the same reasons people have always come to this country, right? There's always a mixed combination of reasons, and I think Randy can probably talk a little bit about this because they've done some surveys on this, but and that has shifted over the years. For a long time, unaccompanied children, and this is important to remember because we hear a lot about separated children recently, we have always in this country had unaccompanied children arriving by themselves. They have not been separated from their families at the border. They've actually traveled from Central America or parts of Mexico or even India and China and all over the world by themselves to come to the United States. Sometimes those children come to join family who preceded them. Sometimes they come looking for family members who came before them, and sometimes those adults don't even know that these kids are coming. And now we're seeing a lot more, especially the kids who are coming with families who are fleeing violence or dangerous situations in their home countries. And very often, I just want to say also that those situations are mixed in with economic situations. Mm-hmm. A lot of times those kids will say, I came to go to school, and when you dig a little deeper, you realize it's dangerous to go to school, gangs control schools, or they're being threatened in those contexts. So there's a lot of mixed reasons, but that's the general overview.
And why have we seen the change in the composition from single males to families? What's causing that shift?
I think that the main reason there is increased violence and increased focus on a broader population being targeted by gangs, organized crime, drug cartels, et cetera, in that region, right? We're talking primarily about 3 countries in Central America, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And there have been political issues there as well, but a lot of the children in particular that you talk to, and the girls, we've seen an increase in the number of girls among the children as well. And what we hear a lot of stories about is gangs who target now girls as property, as ownership, and as ways of targeting a girl or owning a girl is sort of part of the initiation process for some of these gangs. So there's a lot of complicated overlapping factors, but there's clearly been a larger focus on targeting women and girls than there used to be. And in fact, in 1 year, this is going back a few years, but from 2014 to 15, where we saw a big leap in the number of girls coming from this region, just in El Salvador alone, the femicide rate, and that is the number of murders of women based on the fact that they're women for being women, increased by 33% in 1 year. So not really surprising that you would see more women coming in that time frame.
I can imagine that the challenge at the border of those two different types of populations would be radically different. Single men coming over predominantly versus families. To what extent is the system that we have for dealing with the folks who are coming over the border suitable for this new population of families who are coming over?
Do you want to start? I'll start briefly, or do you want to start? The system hasn't changed. So really what's been happening is you're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, right? The facilities at the border for processing people tend to be, and that's both at processing ports of entry, right, the official ports of entry to come in, and at these substations that are along the border run by Border Patrol for people who are apprehended between ports of entry. They tend to be very small. There have been some changes in some of the big ports of entry lately, right? But Border Patrol stations are small. They're broken up into little cells and ways to process people very quickly in a way, generally if you're an adult male coming to work, you don't have authorization, it's a pretty fast process. Take down the information, you can hold them in a cell for a short period of time, and most of them end up being sent straight back to Mexico when that's what you're doing. When you need to send somebody back further than Mexico, it's more complicated, right? You need an airplane, you need schedules, you might need to hold them for more days. When you've got women and children, you have more complications. Where you're going to put them, you need different structures in terms of dividing people up. You don't want to hold women and men in the same cells. You don't want to hold children with unrelated adults. You have issues of traffickers being mixed up among that group. And so even just the physical structure that we have in place is not meant to accommodate the groups that we have. On top of that, the staffing and sort of how the system is run is also not meant to accommodate those. So, and unfortunately, it hasn't changed even knowing what's coming. It's been 10 years that we have been saying at the Women's Refugee Commission, you should be hiring child welfare specialists or just even child care workers to help you take care of these kids at the border, right? Why should a Border Patrol agent who's trained to go out into the field and apprehend people running through the desert or looking for drug traffickers or arms dealers, using them to change diapers for babies and run out and get formula does not make any sense. You could hire people to do that. That would be a better use of money and make the system more efficient, but that has not happened.
Yeah. Randy, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now you can almost think of it as like there's 3 different Border Patrol systems in a way. There's like the system that was always there for the Mexican adults, which is the quick turnaround, send people back to Mexico within hours or days. That applies to some Central American adults. They can put them on a plane sometimes within a day or 2, usually within a week. The problem comes in when people seek asylum. Once they request asylum, then by law they have the right to either file an application if they're kids or go before an immigration judge to defend their asylum case. And that's where everything broke down. And that almost all the families, unaccompanied children are asylum seekers, an increasing number of the adults from Central America are. Right now, there's over 800,000 people on either the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services docket or the immigration judge's docket seeking asylum, over 800,000. The average wait in immigration court is 700 days almost 2 years, right? So what happens then, system number 2, which is the system that was in place throughout the Obama administration when this wave from Central America started in 2014 until the end and was still in place as of last year. System number 2 is someone shows up, claims asylum, is given a pass that smugglers call their permiso to get to stay in the United States until they see the immigration judge at some point in the far future, right? And that, we believe, a lot of analysts believe that's a major, and the administration believes that's a major driver for immigrants to come to the U.S. is if they know that they are going to get to go on the asylum docket, it's like a get out of jail free card. Okay, so that system, though, has been completely supplanted, and we can talk about this in more detail in a minute, by a series of steps that this administration has taken, some of which are radically new. Basically involve sending asylum seekers to other countries, Mexico and Central America, instead of letting them stay here to claim asylum. And that, starting with the Remain in Mexico program, has really turned things around in terms of the flows.
Yeah.
Terrific. So I would like to get there. I want to do one
Right.
step before
Sure.
we get to that, which is a focus of this administration has been on deterrence.
Right.
With this large supply coming in, the logic has been if we make it unpleasant enough, we can get people to make different decisions and not come over. Share with us a little bit about what have some of those measures been, and to what extent have they been effective in reducing the flows of people headed to the U.S.?
So, yeah, there's been a lot of them. The first has been detention. I'm going to start with that, right? We saw family detention being used as a way of trying to deter people from coming. We're going to hold people in detention, whether they're a family, an adult, and not release them and give them this way to stay in the community. We've seen an enormous expansion in the use of immigration detention, where people can sit in detention for very, very long periods of time while they're waiting for their case to be processed. The other was family separation. We all heard about that in 2018, and that was a gradual buildup and then a really broad zero tolerance policy where it exploded, right? And there was a lot of pushback there, and that was an attempt, again, to make it really unpleasant and say to people, what people were being told was, all right, if you want to stay, you're going to insist on coming in, we're going to separate you. Or you can sign, get your kid back right away and go home. Of course, most people actually didn't get their kids back when they went home, so we spent a lot of time working on that. But the next is metering, a process called metering, where they started saying to people who approached the ports of entry, sorry, no room today, situation has changed, only a certain number will get in, you got to get in line. And the reality there, and we can talk about this a little bit more later, but there is no line, right? There's no formal process to get in line. So that created a lot of chaos at the border and a lot of opportunities for exploitation. And also, ironically, right, drove people between ports of entry. Those are the people trying to come in through an official port, and now they couldn't. So we started actually seeing an increase in entries between ports at that time. And the next is this Migration Protection Protocols, MPP, also known as Remain in Mexico, where the administration says, okay, you're coming in and applying for asylum. We are going to start the process, but you're going to wait in Mexico for your hearing. And that could take a very long time. And now we have, I think, a little over 58,000 people who've been sent back under that program. There's also now a policy that says that if you have passed through a country that is a member of the subject to the Refugee Convention, that's signed on to the convention, and have not applied for asylum in that country, then you are ineligible for asylum in the United States. You got to go back. And then sort of associated with that, there's these agreements with 3 countries right now, in Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, that say that those countries will take people that the U.S. sends back under these policies. I think that's the general bulk of them, right?
I think it's worth thinking about the timing a little bit, because
Yeah.
you mentioned the word deterrence. You know, if you talk to people in the Border Patrol, they're all about deterrence. They're all about, they use the term consequences. It's almost like a punishment, right, for coming to the U.S. illegally. And they believe that if the punishment's severe enough, then, you know, what they prefer is that someone arrives at the border, and this is what they can do now with adults under U.S. law, that they can deport them quickly back to their home countries, right? And so that really brought the numbers of Mexican, we had more than 1 million, even 1.5 million in some years, apprehensions of Mexicans, if you're talking about 15, 20 years ago. And those numbers were under control by, say, 2010. Then with this new group that came in, you didn't really have a consequence or a deterrence at first. That was the system 2 I mentioned. Right. Everybody's being released. Right. If we had had this conversation a year ago, in November of 2018, everything that the Trump administration tried to turn it around had failed. Like family separation totally blew up in their face. You know, it was a massive PR disaster enjoined by the courts. They wanted to ban asylum altogether for people who were arrested by the Border Patrol between the ports. So they'd be forced to wait in line for the metering and it'd be a trickle, and that was also overturned by the courts. And like the Obama administration that struggled with the same issue, the courts were saying you cannot detain families for more than 20 days. So long-term family detention is impossible. So after trying several of these things and all of them failing, that's when we really saw the numbers pick up. That's when the number of families reached all-time records, when the number of Honduran Guatemalans apprehended reached all-time records, you know, in 6 months. Thinking again, you know, 6 months ago, which would have been 6 months from this time last year, April and May are over 100,000 total apprehensions per month, right? And that's how we got up to 850,000 apprehensions annually. Then they made the agreement with Mexico. And when they made the agreement with Mexico, that Mexico would take, not all, but a significant number, now almost 60,000, of people into northern Mexico, which is almost as unsafe as Central America. If you look at like official homicide rates, if you watch this series Narcos like I have, or you know, any number of these things, I mean, I don't want to stereotype. It's also a much higher standard of living. The economy is better. There are more jobs in northern Mexico than there are in Central America or southern. But it's not a welcome and very safe place for asylum seekers from Central America. And as soon as they started to put significant numbers in starting in July, that's when the apprehension started to tank. Yeah. And now, as of October, they're back down to about the average for the last few years. So that, the MPP, the Remain in Mexico, so far has been the most effective deterrent. Now you've got these agreements with Central America, you know, layered on top of that, and this transit asylum ban layered on top of that. So you've actually got 3 layers of new deterrence, brand new deterrence, stuff that we've never tried before, essentially sending asylum seekers back outside the country.
Yeah, and I would just add, though, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens over time, right? Because already, what we have often predicted with these things is that you see ebbs and flows, right? So people figure out, okay, this doesn't work, but if you're desperate, what we always see is that people look for a way to find safety. And we've seen these ups and downs before after different decisions in the courts and after different policies get implemented, right? One of the concerns that we really have, and we're really unfortunately starting to see it play out, is that, so 2 things actually. One is you talk about motivation. I mean, at some points we have ourselves wondered, why are more people coming when they're hearing in the news how bad it is in the US, right? We had that little peak. There is a time in which people start saying, and they get told by smugglers, now is your last chance, right? If you're ever going to get into the US, if you're ever going to get away from your current situation, you got to do it now because it's only going to get worse. And so it does increase sometimes people's decision to do it now. But the other thing is people going further underground. So what we see, right, under these circumstances is prices go up. People used to come on their own. They didn't used to need smugglers. Then they started needing coyotes. Then it started becoming a big business. And now people pay even more, right? We're seeing an increase in the number of people who get smuggled in more subversive ways, right? So instead of crossing the border and turning themselves in, which is what people have done for years to cross over and seek asylum, that is not what's happening anymore, right? We've seen a decrease in the numbers overtly, but I worry that what we have is a really large increase under the surface that we don't see that is balancing that out. There's a significant increase in people being smuggled in, for example, in the backs of trucks, under secret hiding places. I think we're going to see more deaths in that respect. And I think we're going to see more people stuck in trafficking situations. I've already had some really concerning conversations with people on the Mexican side of the border who are stuck in these really dangerous situations, who are willing to do anything to get in, right? And so what they're being told now is, give me a little more money than what I was going to give you before, what I was going to charge you before, and I'll take you all the way up to Chicago. We're not going to stop in Texas and turn ourselves in and ask for asylum. I'm going to take you all the way up to where you want to go, and then you'll be safe, right? And the next part of that really worries me, and I'll leave a little bit of this to your imagination, but you can connect the dots, is a woman saying, for example, I don't have that kind of money. And then they say, well, you can work it off when you get there. I got a good job for you, and it'll be okay. You'll work it off. And that's how people end up in these really, what you later will hear about, I'm sure. I'm predicting this, so you can tell me a year from now if I'm right. We're going to see more people in some really frightening trafficking situations.
And there's one other factor we haven't mentioned too, is that for the Central Americans, and actually there's a really major increase in people coming from other parts of all over
Yes.
the world, like led by India and some African countries. It's up to like almost 15% of all the apprehensions in some recent months are
Coming across the southern border.
They fly into South America, or some
Brazil,
actually have
or-
even, there have been stories of people who've flown directly into Mexico and gone across Mexico and then been picked up on the other side of the US border. But they have to get through Mexico first, right? And that's where that agreement this summer with the Mexican government really comes into play. 25,000 National Guards. I mean, this was the new Mexican president's signature new thing, was the National Guard that would help solve the security and crime crisis in Mexico. And a large part of it's been diverted to their southern border with Guatemala, and by some reports even their northern border with the US, to try to stop the flows up to the US under pressure from the US government. And it's actually, that happened kind of in miniature in 2015 in the Obama administration. That was the first time that the Mexican government ever really started enforcing that border, arresting and deporting people. And this past year, they've probably deported more people to Central America than the United States has. In fact, in 2015 and 2016, in both those years, they deported more people to Central America than the United States did. So Mexico's playing a very central role now as kind of a gatekeeper for illegal immigration across the border from the rest of the world. Kind of analogous in some ways to what Turkey has been doing with the European Union recently.
Yeah, and with a lot of support from the US, both pressure and financial support.
So in terms of the experience of the migrants, is that a better answer for them?
I mean, Mexico does not have close to the capacity to process all the asylum applicants that they could, if everybody were to apply for asylum in Mexico. Until recently, they only had 4 offices in the entire country where you could apply for asylum. There has been a buildup of that process, so that is one good thing. So there's more opportunity, but the system in Mexico, even per the Mexican government and UNHCR, for example, is not even close to being able to process people. So most people don't actually get a shot at asylum in Mexico. They get deported right away. And children especially, one of the issues with children is that they will actually hide from the Mexican social services in Mexico because they're almost never given the opportunity to seek asylum if they do come into contact with the authorities. They get sent back right away. I mean, that could change. I think there's a lot of efforts to develop a system in Mexico, but it's right now pretty far from being sufficient.
Well, yeah, and I mean, and the president of Mexico, I mean, his agenda is to develop Mexico, especially southern Mexico and the areas that are bordering Central America, to try to create jobs, to try to create more security, more human security, more economic rights and dignity for the Mexican population. That's hard to do when you have refugee camps of tens of thousands, and essentially they're refugee camps now in some parts of the border with the US, maybe even along the border with Guatemala, and you've got pockets of Central Americans. Now you're promising the United States, well, we're going to find jobs for these Central Americans, we're going to grant them asylum, we're going to keep them safe. At the same time, we're working on all these development plans for our own population that are desperately needed. I mean, that puts the Mexican government in a really precarious position because it's very difficult to deliver on all of that. And this diversion of the National Guard away from the hot spots where there's been a lot of violence that's been getting worse to the border with Guatemala is, just one example of the kind of trade-offs that they have to face.
Yeah. So the rationale for the tough policies along the border or the attempts to restrict border crossing is frequently put in terms of it creates greater safety in the United States of various kinds, right? Controls the number of folks who are coming into the society, allows us to be more discriminating about who comes into the country, and results in better outcomes in the United States. What's your sense for what the effects of these policies are on this side of the border?
I'll use her.
Yeah, I mean, Michelle, you can follow up on your point about trafficking and going underground, because that's clearly, I mean, another example of that is now, as part of the, cutting down on asylum, making asylum harder, they're going to make it much harder for people who are applying for asylum and already in process to get work permits. So now they're going to be forcing them to work under the table more. So this criminalization, pushing the population into the shadows, that's happening in combination with this stepped up immigration and customs enforcement, the ICE operations that we've all read about, that pushing people into the shadows doesn't really help economically, and I don't think it helps socially either. I mean, it's traumatizing for a lot of immigrant families. It's going to make it more difficult for them to interact socially and integrate with the rest of the society. Even people who've been here for decades now are afraid, for good reason. And at the same time, people aren't going to be able to work in the kinds of jobs that are commensurate with their skills if they can't work legally. We're in this demographic situation. If you talk to the economists, they would say, in the next 10 years, actually, and within less than 10 years, if we didn't have immigrants and we didn't have immigrants' children, our workforce would start to shrink, kind of like Japan's or some Southern European countries have done. We need immigrants and the second generation, their children, to grow the workforce in the future. So, and right now we have nearly record low unemployment, so it's not like there isn't work to do. Right? It's not like there aren't job opportunities, and immigrants come wanting to do that. Now, of course, that collides with the whole idea of asylum. If people are coming to work to better their families, they're not technically coming for asylum, right? I mean, there's a difference between fleeing persecution and well-founded fear of persecution and coming to make life better to work. But the reality is, I don't think that hurts us. What would hurt us is that if people get driven further underground, and we have more and larger pockets of people, they don't want to talk to the police, they don't want to cooperate with the government, that kind of thing. And then finally, I would say, it's hard to do good research on this, but most of the research that's been done shows lower crime rates among immigrants than the general population, including Mexicans and Central Americans. There's a lot of examples of people who've killed people who happen to be unauthorized immigrants. There's also a lot of examples of mass shooters who were U.S. born. I mean, there's the statistics don't bear out that this is a dangerous population, but it's easy to find examples and to stereotype the population based on a few extreme cases, and that's kind of what's being done. And I'm not sure your polls or Pew's polls support, I don't think the general U.S. population necessarily buys that, but enough voters do, that it can make a difference.
Yeah, and I would just say, I think you hit on all the main points, but I would just add, first, one point on the asylum seekers. Right, if you're coming for asylum, you're fleeing persecution, but that doesn't mean you don't also need to feed your family, right? And so I think that there's a real difference here between sort of what people have traditionally thought of as the asylum seeker, who is the sort of intellectual protester dissident that we've romanticized from the 70s and 80s, or the Russian, the Soviet defector, who can maybe afford to live for a while they're waiting for their case, but when we talk about the sort of kinds of people who are fleeing now, they can't, right? So the fact that you need to work doesn't mean that you're not coming here because you're afraid of fleeing something. That's one point I would make. And then in terms of the safety, I think the point that Andy made and that I made about the trafficking and creating really a level of fear in which you're discouraging people from trusting or going to the authorities in the US is not a way to create safe spaces in this country, right, for all of us. It's not safe for any of us if an immigrant is afraid to go to the police about something that they know is happening or when they're a victim of something. And then finally, I would just globalize it a little bit in the sense that the U.S. role in being a safe haven or a place that really we pushed as a nation, right, for the world to sign a refugee convention so that we wouldn't have another situation like World War II or the Holocaust, and where we wouldn't, again, be sending people to their deaths, has really served as a stabilizing force in the world as well. And I think that there will be consequences to turning our backs on that are worth thinking about.
And one of the things that's been interesting here in Chicago and in many cities around the country is that city leaders, mayors, city councils have responded to this set of issues with declaring sanctuary cities. Could you help us understand kind of where does that response fit in? What can it accomplish? What doesn't it accomplish? Do we understand what this is? Help us understand what this is in your view of it.
Yeah, so Chicago, Cook County is the leader in this area. Like the Cook County Detainer Ordinance in 2011, midway through the Obama administration, was the first really strict policy that said the local police will not cooperate with U.S. and Customs and Immigration Enforcement, will not hand over almost anyone who's arrested by the local police from a local jail, from the Cook County Jail, to ICE. And then California followed suit in 2014 with statewide legislation. New York City over those same years followed suit. But, and unlike other places that are sometimes uncomfortable being called sanctuaries or uncomfortable with the pressure that's applied, the threats of funding in states like Texas, they passed legislation that someone at the local level who says they're a sanctuary can actually be given jail time if they don't cooperate with ICE. But the local elected officials, all the way up to the congressional leadership here locally have been very proud to be a sanctuary and have been very proud to be out in front and say, this is our policy. So that's kind of leading a wave of resistance. So we did some research. One of the things that people understand is despite all of the talk that nobody's supposed to be safe now, that everybody's supposed to be afraid, all these words have come from leaders in the Trump administration, that the Trump administration's only arresting about half as many immigrants inside the U.S. as the Obama administration was arresting like 6 or 7 years ago in 2011 and 2012, right? Why? It's because of the Cook County Ordinance. It's because of the California Truth and Values Act. It's because of New York City's policies. These policies really make a difference. That's why former Attorney General Jeff Sessions spent so many press conferences talking about it and trying to come up with ways to threaten places to cooperate. But this just leads to more polarization. So this polarization of opinion that you have in the U.S. public about are unauthorized immigrants lawbreakers or are they contributors to the economy? Should they be protected like in a sanctuary or should they be arrested and deported? That's played out in increasing polarization of state and local elected officials around the country in really adversarial court settings against the federal government in some cases.
Yeah, and maybe people already know this, but I think it's worth clarifying, right? Being a sanctuary city and saying you're not going to cooperate on ICE, on detainers, does not mean that if an immigrant commits a crime, nobody goes after them and they just go free, right? But a lot of people think that. I have people coming to me in tears saying, oh my God, immigrants don't get arrested when they commit a crime. They're completely separate issues, right? So police still do their work in terms of policing. And the part that they're not cooperating on is that they are not going to be asking people about their immigration status, and they're not going to be handing people over for deportation proceedings based on the fact that they're now in custody. And the logic behind that really is a public safety issue from the perspective of these urban areas, right? The idea is we don't want immigrants, we don't want people who are undocumented to be afraid of us, to not cooperate when we're investigating crimes, to not come to court when they have to come to court. And I think an example of that, for example, is a real effort when the Trump administration came in, was to start going to pick people up at courthouses, right? So we had a lot of cases suddenly of women going in on domestic violence cases. They would go in to testify against a partner, and they would be picked up and deported, right? So we have seen an enormous drop in those kinds of complaints, requests for protective orders, and other kinds of complaints against domestic abuse, just as an example, right? But I think all kinds of crime reporting goes down. The idea behind a sanctuary city is to try to counter that and say, look, this is a safe space. You're not going to get in trouble if you come and report a crime.
Yeah, I think the other thing, right, too, you said, well, people have this misconception that means people aren't arrested. No, this is they've been arrested. If they've been convicted, they've served their jail time already at the state prison if it's something really serious, and then they go into ICE custody, and even Cook County doesn't stop that because people are sent out of the county to the state prison, and they have an agreement with ICE. But what can happen is that someone could come in and post bail on a local charge and then get deported before they even get a chance to go before the judge for their local crime, right? A lot of times it's a minor traffic offense, but it could be more serious than that. So from that sense, too, it kind of short circuits the criminal justice system. The other thing I would say is that just because a place is a sanctuary doesn't mean it's really a sanctuary. Like, people have this vision of, like, people go into church, ICE won't go into the church, which is true, or they won't go into the school. But ICE has its own officers that do arrest people on the streets of Chicago and New York and California on a weekly or daily basis. No sanctuary, state or local policy can stop that from happening. Right. But the reality is that about 2/3 of all the arrests originate with the local police. So ICE has a limited number of officers who can go out into the community to do these operations, and that's probably the main reason why these sanctuary and sanctuary-like policies are so effective.
So we've talked about, and I set this up in terms of the polarization over this issue, and as two people who are deeply involved in the actualities of immigration, we know what the rhetoric is. Do you see efforts, constructive efforts, where people are trying to, at the policy level, or are willing to try to grapple with alternative approaches to what we're seeing?
Well, we are. I mean, that's kind of our mission, but it's hard, right? Because it used to be like 10 years ago, there were a lot of Republicans in Congress who met with Democrats at MPI at our offices to discuss comprehensive immigration reform, and it was at both sides of the aisle. Yeah. S-744 passed in 2013 by 70 votes or something like that. Those days are long gone. It's very hard to find people, and you've had movement apart on both parties. You've had people talking about abolishing ICE altogether, and completely decriminalizing the border, and so the sides are getting farther apart. A lot of people, I think, in the business community, say they're concerned and try to support a middle ground where they can get the workers they need from higher income, higher skilled levels all the way through, in a lot of different industries. I say they say that because you don't see as much sometimes vocal support in action from the business community. They're not motivated the way that the populace on the right are motivated, and increasingly, the immigrant advocates on the left. Those two sides are really motivated, and the people in the center don't seem to have the same amount of oomph,
Yeah. And I would just add that, we at the Women's Refugee Commission, I did a lot of work in the past with administrative agencies, with ICE, with CBP, and with Health and Human Services, who takes care of the kids, on creating programs to address some of these issues, right? So we worked on an alternative to detention for families, where you could actually solve the problem of not being able to detain families and not wanting to just release them, to come up with a case management program that was 99.8% effective according to ICE, right? ICE did their own assessment of the program and found it to be successful and cheap. And that is now out the window. So we used to work together to come up with solutions. I have to say that's become really difficult. I wouldn't say it's impossible. I think there's some pockets still in which you can figure out, okay, we agree that this is a problem and we want to come up with a way to fix it. But I think the major issue now is it's just become incredibly polarized. I think this administration's goal very openly is to make things so bad people don't want to come anymore. Not to solve a problem, really, right? Not to find a way to manage what's happening, but to just stop it and make it go away. So that makes it hard.
So I'm going to turn to the audience to open up the discussion to them as well, but I want to point out one of the things that we discovered in our poll, and it's shown up the last 3 years very similarly to this, where there's greater consensus than I think most people would anticipate. We asked a question of whether or not each of the following set of measures is effective for dealing with the issue of illegal immigration. And one of the things that we asked is creating a pathway to citizenship for those illegal immigrants who agree to pay taxes, speak English capably, have a clean criminal record, and have steady employment. And 81% of Americans said, that's a good policy. We ought to support that, right? Including 88% of Democrats, 77% of independents, and 76% of Republicans. So in the public, where some issues we've had polarization, there are also issues like this around which there continues to be or even growing levels of consensus. So perhaps that's a place where things can move forward. Let me turn it to the audience to ask a question. Please wait for the microphone so people online can hear, and I'll start with the woman right in front, please.
Hi. What can you say about the effects of these trial and error policies on the people who are working the front lines and even the people who are working with you?
It's been hard. I think we have a lot of traumatized people working on this issue. I think what's become difficult is, first of all, I'll say that the level of trauma we see in the populations we work with has increased significantly. So that part, I think, has made things harder. I've been interviewing children in immigration custody for over 20 years. The kids I interview these days are a lot more traumatized than what I used to see in 10 or 20 years ago. And a lot of that is not just because of what they've gone through before they came here and what they've gone through on the journey, but how they've been received when they got to the United States. I mean, family separation caused a level of trauma that I've never experienced before. And then I think the other piece is that people are really overwhelmed. Randy and I were talking about this before coming out here today. I mean, every day there's something new, and every day it changes. So just even the amount of information to absorb and what you could possibly do about it has become really overwhelming. And then I would just also add, for those, I don't do this, but for those people, neither Andy nor I do this, but for attorneys who are actually representing asylum seekers, I saw a really sad tweet from one of them recently that was heartbreaking because it said, for the first time in my career, I'm wondering whether it's worth going into court for my client because it's so unlikely they're going to get anything, right? And that's really hard.
Mm-hmm. Please, woman right in the back.
Thank you for your presentation. I just wanted to ask, I know the investment on the wall is about, I don't know, over 10 billion or something like that. Is that make sense to go over that amount of expenditure or something that, in my opinion, will create more illegal smuggling, and it's going to, as you were saying in your presentation, it's going to make the price even higher for those families who are trying to cross the border. And that's on the wall side, the investment on that. And then the other one, you talk about how industries or, don't get into this kind of fight to argue about the labor force. Have that ever been measured? I mean, assuming that we stop immigration 100% in a scenario like that, what would be the economic impact in the U.S. in terms of labor force and price to consumers, at the end of it?
A couple of things.
Yeah, I mentioned the growth in the labor force. I mean, most of that growth is actually in the second generation, those children born to immigrant parents. If we actually completely cut off immigration entirely and had zero for the next 20 years, our labor force would still grow. It would just grow more slowly. So I think that's part of the reason why we're also concerned about immigrant families and kids, right? Because if the children are growing up in a situation where it's harder for them to function because they're worried about their parents and their parents are anxious, having more difficulty in school, that's going to have a big impact on the future workforce too. Now, of course, as far as what would be the impact on certain industries if you cut off all immigration, be devastating for who uses the H-1B workers, the high-skilled specialty occupations like computer programmers, universities, healthcare systems use these workers a lot. The agricultural industry has become increasingly reliant on the H-2A, temporary, seasonal, low-skilled agricultural workers, because they don't have nearly as many unauthorized immigrants from Mexico as they once had who can work there. So you have scenarios, you can see like how this has played out in extreme cases in agriculture. In Georgia, when they passed a very restrictive anti-immigrant law, they had a massive loss in their agricultural sector like the next year. And so they after that, they dialed back a little bit at the state level. California's had a long-term problem in their agricultural sector. A lot of those jobs have moved to Mexico. A lot of land's gone out of production. So that's just to give you some examples.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, please, the man right here.
Hey, thank you for the presentation. I thought it was really well done. I read something interesting. It says that the U.S. empire thrives on amnesia. So the context there is, to what extent do you think that the U.S. military involvement in the 3 cities that we mentioned, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, think about American fruit, right? The capital plundering, the coups that have been supported. So to what extent do you think that American foreign policy bears responsibility here? And I'm sort of alluding to the fact that I do think that it does. Why do you think that it's not discussed? It's not talked about. You know, we talk about exceptionalism and Democrats, Republicans, but again, I'm pretty clear. I'm making the assumption or the claim that there is some responsibility. Why is that not something that we discuss in detail? Because I think it's critical to the equation. Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, and you could go further back to the war between Texas and Mexico and the U.S. and Mexico. I mean, there's a lot of history of imperialism, to use a word, in the Western Hemisphere under the U.S. And for me, it's a matter of looking at the past to inform the future and thinking about, okay, we talk about our development assistance to the region, and that's one of the issues that's been a hot topic, with the president at times saying there shouldn't be any development assistance at all if there's no cooperation on migration, using that as kind of a bargaining chip or a leverage. Members of Congress would say, well, give me the proof that this development assistance is actually being spent wisely. And that's a valid point, because it could be just supporting the same elites that we've supported, for decades in those countries, and distorting their democratic process using U.S. funding. For instance, if it goes to support, I don't know, a road that cuts through a sensitive area to go to a certain manufacturing plant, or port infrastructure development, or a dam for hydroelectric power. All those kinds of things have been very controversial in the region, not just historically, but now. And they've been tied to murders of environmentalist advocates for the environment. They've been tied to human rights violations, indigenous groups that have been displaced, et cetera. So to me, it's less a matter of thinking backwards than thinking forwards. We're engaged in the region. We have to be engaged in the region. We've been engaged in the region for over 100 years, for better or worse. We have to continue to be engaged in the region. We can do it one of two ways. We can do it in a coercive way that in the long run is probably going to be self-destructive, because it's going to create the conditions for more migration and more poverty in the region, or we can try to do it in a more constructive way and figure out the kinds of development strategies that are really going to work, that are going to reform police and judicial systems to create safer societies, that are going to work with local governments to create jobs and safe zones. I mean, this has worked in parts of El Salvador to substantially reduce violence levels, to try to fund agricultural changes in areas that are experiencing really awful droughts. I mean, something we haven't talked about yet is climate change, right? There's no climate change visa, right, in the United States. There's no climate change visa concept yet, although I think they're thinking about it globally. I think we just need to think forward about what are the kinds of cooperative strategies that are going to work, and I think that's a really important key to resolving these issues.
Terrific. Let's keep coming this direction with the woman right here in the middle. I'll come there next, but right here, the woman in the dark vest.
Hi, thanks again for your presentation. It was really good. So I know that the both of you mentioned the agreement between the U.S. and Mexico right now for them to accept some of the asylum seekers, and how there are about 60,000, I think, if that was the number. What is the benefit for the Mexican government to participate in this agreement?
Well, I mean, there was the threat of tariffs. I mean, it wasn't, the benefit is not having the Mexican economy killed by cutting off trade with the U.S. I mean, the president was quite explicit about that in the lead up to the June agreement. And I think that, you know, the president of Mexico, López Obrador, took that very seriously. He didn't want to do anything to jeopardize the first year of his new administration with a severe economic crisis. The U.S. government had already levied very destructive tariffs on Chinese goods, so there was already a precedent, so it wasn't an idle threat. I think that's the main thing, but I also just think generally that President López Obrador wanted to be as cooperative on a good foot with President Trump as possible. From what I understand, many leaders of the world have taken that position and promised pretty extreme things in exchange for President Trump's goodwill. So I believe that's probably what's going on in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador right now. I think I would mention in the case of El Salvador, there was a tangible benefit to signing an agreement to take asylum seekers from the United States, and that the U.S. government agreed to continue temporary protected status for 200,000 Salvadorans for another year after that agreement was signed. So there's a lot of quid pro quo going on, to use a term, in immigration policy regionally right now. Now, again, to get back to that earlier question, is quid pro quo the right way to do foreign policy and regional development? Is it really cooperative? I don't know. It'll be really interesting to see going forward if this administration or new administration, how they maneuver with all these agreements and ideas already in place, right?
Yeah. Terrific. And the woman right here, please.
Hi, good evening. Mary Meg McCarthy from NIJC. Welcome, Michelle and Randy. I work at the National Immigrant Justice Center. We're here in Chicago, and you know, I really appreciated your remarks and thoughts from a really big picture perspective. And I want to reiterate what you said, Randy, about Chicago and Illinois being such a welcoming city. I think we were just recognized as the most welcoming city in the nation by the New Americans Economy Study, which was great and a real tribute, I think, not only to our elected officials, but also to the civic, the business, the legal community. We work with about 1,500, 1,800 pro bono attorneys here in Chicago with my colleague Chad. And so we represent individuals here. Many of you may have heard about the pizza raid. They went into a pizzeria and raided and arrested a mother, and we got a call from the mayor's office saying her children are in the public schools. We need to figure out how to get these children to safety and get help for this mother who was sitting in a jail in McHenry County. And so, like you said, Michelle, it's like every day there's something new happening. We're also on the border, and I just wanted to follow up what you mentioned about the Migration Protection Protocol. We're representing individuals who are caught in that program down in Laredo, Texas, and in San Diego. And it's really appalling to see how those fundamental constitutional rights of due process and recognition of people's human rights are being eroded. And, you know, the rules say if you win asylum, you should be able to stay in the U.S. and you're not forced back to Mexico. What we're seeing is they're changing those rules. We win a case down there, and all of a sudden, the individual is being turned back to Mexico while the government appeals. Totally contrary to what the rules were set up to be. And then we see people who are living in really dangerous situations. So
do you have a question to build on with that?
Yeah, I've just wondered, how do we keep this on the forefront in terms of the news and what's happening, so that people in the center, but who believe in due process and human rights, recognize these are human beings whose rights are not being recognized and upheld?
Yeah. Well, I mean, hopefully with programs like this one, right? But I do think there's a real danger, right, Mary Meg, in the, we saw a real awareness and response from the public with family separation, right? And I think a lot of that was because it really it resonated with people. They understood it and could feel it, right? They could envision themselves there. I think the real danger with what the administration has accomplished, frankly, now, is that they've moved it to Mexico. What is happening now at the border is hidden away from people, Even attorneys can't get in to a lot of these initial hearings, and it's really, really problematic. Journalists can't get in. Attorneys have limited access. It's not open to the public. There's secret hearings in a lot of these cases. And so if people don't know about them, they can't disapprove of them. So I think the first thing is to shed light on it somehow. And I mean, I know we're all working on trying to figure out how to do that, right?
But I also think, I mean, the media is so much more on top of this issue. I mean, we've had these discussions internally at MPI. I mean, there's such a broader group of media and a lot of people who are new in the field studying immigration now. Everybody's interested in immigration. I think the president will keep it on the front burner.
That's good.
I don't think we have to worry about it. I think he wants people to get upset by immigration policies, actually wants the opposition. And so a key is for the opposition not to stand down, right? Because the community organizing that's been happening to tell people you're not required by law to open the door if ICE knocks on your door unless they have a warrant from a judge, right? You're not required to let them into your car or get out of your car unless you have a warrant signed by a judge. You know, all of these growing number actually now of the purple jurisdictions, you know, cities like Raleigh and Charlotte, North Carolina, are backing out of ICE cooperation. Now it's starting to spread beyond your traditional blue hubs like Chicago, New York, and California. So it's that opposition. The opposition is growing in strength. Yeah. It's an action-reaction. It's almost like a physics problem, I think, you know? The stronger that this core of restrictions on immigrants get and threats on immigrants get, it's the stronger the opposition and reaction is getting. As long as that continues, I think it will keep people's attention. Now, I have to take a prerogative because I always forget to answer one part of a question, that last question on Mexico. Another factor that shouldn't be undercounted is that the Mexican population is increasingly not so welcoming towards Central Americans. The large caravans that went through a year ago at first were welcomed, but over time, in terms of the numbers and the kind of burdens that landed on some local communities from southern Mexico all the way to northern Mexico, turned a fair amount of the Mexican public opinion against Central American migrants. And that's another reason, I think, an important reason, why the Mexican government's been willing to take this crackdown, unfortunately.
So two things. One of the norms that we have here is actually ending on time, so I unfortunately need to bring this conversation to a close. But I appreciate all of you being here today because I think this is a conversation that is a very important and also very heated one in our society, and I appreciate you being here to learn more through this program tonight. So please join me in thanking our experts tonight.